Welcome to the Counselling Armchair, Nurturing Wellbeing and Study, hosted by Counselling and Psychological Services at RMIT University. The Counselling Armchair is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the land. This podcast aims to help you manage your university life so you can be at your best. We'll be sharing with you tips on student life here and ways to enhance your mental well-being.
Welcome back to the Counselling Armchair. In today's episode, we'll be chatting about modern masculinity and the impact of gender expectations on men, and really on all the people around men. Gender norms and societal pressures have a huge role in shaping who we are, so we'll be discussing how it can affect mental health, relationships, identity, and sexuality. To help us explore modern masculinity, we have two excellent guests today. Lance Danger, a provisional psychologist who was on placement at RMIT Counselling and Psychological Services and is currently researching this topic as part of his master's thesis, and Michael Swadling, a clinical psychologist at RMIT and my study buddy as we were training to be psychologists so many years ago. So firstly, welcome Lance. It's great to have you back for this conversation. To kick things off, could you share a little about yourself and how you became interested in this area?
Sure. So, well, first of all, I'm a man and a husband and a father of four pretty great children, one girl and three boys. I love keeping fit, basketball and swimming and rock climbing. And I love my work in schools as a counsellor. And I've been studying psychology since 2016. So my initial interest in this topic was partly just being a man, but also my honours thesis was in this kind of area looking at the impact of, masculine norms and intimate partner violence. And my master's thesis is in a similar area, looking at sort of male expressions of depression and also, intimate partner violence again. So, that's kind of a bit about me.
Yeah, we're very lucky to have you to chat about this. And Michael, longtime RMIT counsellor and first-time podcast guest, hopefully not the last time. Can you tell our listeners a bit about you?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, folks. So I'm Michael, also a man. I've been a counsellor here at RMIT for around 10 years now. I'm a clinical psychologist. My interests perhaps are a bit different than Lance's. I'm not much of a sporty, sort of active person, trend a bit more towards nerdy interests and hobbies. And I think, part of my interest in this space, I think, is about, the different impacts of gender expressions on men. In our profession of psychology, only about 20% of practitioners are male. And even in terms of the people who come and see us at the counselling service, I think we notice that less men proportionally present than women through the counselling service. So I think there's, the gender impacts even reach as far as accessing healthcare, for example. I'm also what might be considered very online, I suppose. And so that means that, part of my interest around gender is sort of the ways that gender gets discussed in online communities. And I think we'll get onto that a little bit later, but I think there's some very interesting impacts there in the way that perceptions of gender are transformed over recent years.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael and Lance. It's so great to have you on board with us today. And, so good to have two men to talk about this topic because, it's something Melissa and I could never have any lived experience of. So we're really, really pleased that you could be here with us to talk about this. Lance, I have the first one for you, which is just reflecting on the fact that identity development has a range of influences, and a key time for identity formation is usually the adolescent or young adult years. So could you talk us through some of the influences on the development of masculine identity?
Well, it's a very good question, a very complicated question, I reckon.
True.
Because I think although it does, a lot of identity formation happens in those adolescents and young adult years, I think a lot of it actually comes right from our very early experiences of our main caregivers, usually our father and our mother, but sometimes grandparents and uncles and aunties and others. And so, I think we develop our ideas about what masculine and feminine traits are, in our families through media and, certainly schools and, lots and lots of different influences, I guess, on what it is to be a man. Come from so many different influences, I think. And so I guess it depends on what you've experienced within your family and within your wider culture as well. Like if you look at maybe some Asian cultures, they're more likely to hug and be affectionate and stuff like that as men, whereas often in the Western world it's like the strong silent type, or the slapping each other's butts at football, or that sort of thing is a masculine norm. So it's it really depends on your particular culture. Even within the space of 20 kilometres, think of my work in Melbourne. Certain areas, the masculine norms within that area were different from where I'm currently working in sort of a semi-rural part of Melbourne. So
yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, as you said, it's so complex. There's such a myriad of influences. You couldn't just pin it down and say, well, it works like this, because it's going to be so unique for each person.
That's right. Yeah. So I think we primarily, it's through our attachment to our parents, but there's coaches, there's teachers, grandparents, other key people in our life, and peers as well. Like, certainly in those early adolescence, the people that you surround yourself with are kind of showing you what the norms of those type of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit more about traditional masculine norms and the potential challenges? Which norms are particularly problematic?
Yeah, so my initial study was looking at a very large 10,000 men. That's called the 10 to Men study. And we were looking at particularly 11 different types of what they call conformity and masculine norms index. And so they sort of are norms that within sort of traditional societies, I guess, things like winning, emotional control, risk-taking, violence, dominance, being a playboy, or having lots of partners, self-reliance, which I think is a big one for men, primacy of work, work being really, really important, power over women, and pursuit of status, and not being seen as homosexual. So they're the kind of the 11 different norms that were studied in the paper the data set that we were looking at. I guess in terms of what that looks like in reality is, we have this within particularly Western society, feel like men have to conform to this so that they can be masculine, to be a man. And so that becomes problematic, I think, in a lot of different ways. So obviously the study that I did in my honours was, it did find that there was 6 of those norms relate to higher incidence of committing violence against their partner, but there are also lots of other negative outcomes, I guess, for men and for women and for societies in general. For those that do conform highly. So health outcomes and a range of different things that have been studied.
Yes, so interesting. That research is really interesting because, as you say, it's impacts on women and people around the men, but it's also men's health, and like, as you said, sort of things like maybe not being willing to take good care of themselves.
Don't have to go see a doctor because even though I've got this, heart problem or whatever. Yeah.
That's right. And somehow that's sort of more contemporary. Like I often think about when I was younger, what did we call them? Snag, sensitive new age guy, was this idea of like the sort of, a little bit sort of softer, but it was like a girly man, it was a man who cared about his appearance, maybe dressed nicely, maybe expressed his feelings. But there was always a derision behind that presentation of a guy, even though personally as a woman, that is exactly the kind of man that I wanted to find, So it's interesting how, amongst men, I don't know, I'm hoping it's different now.
There are changes happening in a positive direction, but we also know that, there's a heck of a lot of intimate partner violence occurring in our world. More than one woman a week is being killed by a former or current partner sort of thing in Australia, and the stats are much higher in other parts of the world as well. So there are some parts of masculinity that are challenging and problematic, and I think it's worth talking about them, not so much as a negative, but just to be talking about it and to start to sort of push into it and see if we can make some change.
Absolutely. And I think it's really great for it to be coming from men like yourself and Michael to be sort of having the conversations, because you are the experts in being, being men, you can comment on this. When it comes from women, maybe the message doesn't get through as much. So I think these conversations we're having today are really powerful.
Yeah, it is often, I think, really powerful to have conversations between men and have men talking about this a bit more, because I think women do talk about it a lot, but then maybe we're just talking to women.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we do need to start developing a less traditional and maybe a modern type of masculinity that does include that kind of sensitive new age guy kind of vibe, but still retain some of the positive aspects of masculinity.
This next question is for you, Michael. Are there ways in which these traditional masculine norms that Lance has just been talking about with us could actually cause harm? And we've alluded to some of that, but if you could dig in a little bit more, harm to those that hold them or those around them.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. As Lance sort of noted there, that, a lot of the models and definitions of masculinity are kind of, they're defined by restriction or opposition. They're not certain things, so they're not vulnerable, they're not open, they don't express their emotions because that's sort of weakness. And so we sort of see, life narrowing as a consequence of that, right? If you're opting out of things, then just inherently you've got less options, less flexibility, less ability to adapt to changing circumstances. We've sort of touched on physical and mental health impact there, that men tend to be worse at seeking help. There also might be less likely to disclose things even if they do seek help. I've noticed that sometimes I've shared a patient with someone else at the counselling service. They've seen them one year and I've seen them the next year. And I think it's interesting, even in those contexts, what they'll share with a man or what they'll share with a woman. Different people have different decisions there. But when it's a male client, often they're seeking out a male therapist in particular because they feel like they can only be sort of honest and comfortable here. Or alternatively, in some cases, they really can't share because they feel like, oh, this is going to be another man looking at me as I tell them this thing. And that's going to be a lot of shame because I feel judged by men in a way that I sort of don't feel judged, perhaps in the same way by women. Now, consequence of that, that shame being sort of a powerful motivator, it's a really uncomfortable one, and it pulls us away from a lot of behaviour. And often what can get activated there is kind of anger. That people can become, in some cases, aggressive, or they can lash out because they feel really uncomfortable. They feel ashamed because of all the lessons that they've learned over life about how a man's meant to act. And that violence is, we of course have lots of public messages about violence not being acceptable, from anyone. And yet there's still perhaps an undertone that violence is a kind of more masculine activity. And so that can lead to this being sort of, in some ways, seen as an okay-ish thing to do. It's the wrong thing to do, but sort of understandable if someone crosses a line there in a way that we perhaps wouldn't have, we wouldn't sort of carve out a space like that around other activities. But somehow, especially in a peer-to-peer sense, I think that, men can be overly forgiving of other men's lashing out or aggression.
That just puts me in mind. I've got two nephews who are now in their 30s, beautiful men. When they were younger, they used to wrestle with each other all the time. And they'd come over and they'd be on the floor shoving and pushing each other around. I'd go, guys, is there anything better you could be doing with your time? And they'd go, nah, and they'd just keep doing it, And I said to my sister, what are we doing about this? And she goes, oh, well, boys will be boys. And it's like, whew, that expression is just so right there. She's obviously absorbed that gender norm as well from a really early age of if that was two sisters on the floor wrestling, it'd be like, nice girls don't behave that way, sit primly on the chair thing, but boys will be boys. And that, they were behaving in quite aggressive ways to each other. Neither of them are aggressive at all in any way now, but it was just interesting when they were little how that behaviour was just kind of seen as normal.
There's lots of reasons that we see different, gendered behaviour, and some of that might be some biological factors, and of course there's a lot of sociocultural factors, right? That people learn that men act in certain ways, and roughhousing, sports, exertion are all things that are coded more towards being masculine activities, so men are more likely to do them. I'm hoping in that instance those nephews aren't hurting each other. Maybe they are just having a good time, but at the same time, as you noted, that there's still kind of a line that gets drawn by their parent there who says, well, it's okay for boys to do this, but as you noted, maybe that'd be a bit different if it was girls, or if it was a girl and a boy doing that. We might immediately go, oh, this doesn't feel okay. I think that's really interesting. When I talk about sort of avoidance, like I mentioned, anger, but we sort of see other behaviours that sometimes pop up there. So, when we're trying to run away from emotions, we do all sorts of things to suppress them. Everyone does. But, if men are sometimes some men are more drawn towards suppressing emotions than other people for some of the reasons we've talked about. And so you might see other kind of ways of suppressing that. So, it can be turned inwards and become a sort of really self-hatred, sort of low self-esteem kind of stuff. You can see sometimes substance use and abuse, coming in there as a way of kind of numbing or avoiding other kind of things. Always drawn back to that idea of kind of rejection of behaviour. So this idea that, well, I can't do certain things because they're girly, they're feminine. So I couldn't share a sort of deep and meaningful moment with a friend when I'm having a tough time because, that's a bit too feelingsy, right? And I can't really go there because guys don't do that. And on the other side, we perhaps see that then loads these interactions that men have with women. That, an interaction with a female friend who's being a good support like she would with any of her other friends gets interpreted by the man as romantic interest or as this sort of special closeness, when actually this is just friendship, but the man doesn't have experiences of friendship that are like this because all of their male friends wouldn't do this. They don't do this, their friends don't do this. So when someone is able to have this sort of really deep conversation with them, they go, oh, there must be something special here. You know, that they're kind of missing out on this opportunity to have these deep and close friendships because they're saying, well, I'm a guy, most of my friends are guys, and guys don't talk like this. Guys don't do this kind of thing, you know, and I think that's a real loss, and it puts a big burden on women to be emotional supports for men in their lives sometimes. Not always, but I think that's such a common pattern for young women to fall into, is to be, emotional assistants or something, that they're sort of there to help regulate the men in their lives' emotions.
And maybe the only one in their life that's doing that for them. Whereas I think women do spread that out in quite a lot of baskets, amongst girlfriends and things.
And especially when they do enter romantic relationships, I think that can be, such a factor that a man who's in a romantic relationship and maybe doesn't have good spaces, doesn't have good ways of looking at their own feelings, like that feels a bit too introspective, creates these kind of unhealthy dynamics where either they're overly dependent or they're really closed to their partner, or maybe they swing between those 2 points. And, any of those, I think, cause friction, add this big load to the other person involved. And we're saying sort of men and women here, but of course queer relationships have these features too, that, masculinity gets internalized by everyone. And so, queer men often also sort of internalize some of these. It depends on the person, depends on the experiences and the environments they're in. But, even gay men often feel this pressure to sort of perform masculinity in a certain way, to be seen as masculine. And I think that can be really sort of restricting and harmful for the person, which is not to say that, people aren't allowed to do those things. I think that, everyone should be allowed to, but they should be doing it out of free choice rather than feeling like they just have to do this because this is the box they're meant to fit into. And then Lance mentioned as well the work issues, so men are more likely to perhaps to overwork in a professional sense, although they statistically do a bit less unpaid labour around the house, for example. So their partner's probably picking up the slack somewhere else, but they're drawing the big salary. Again, ongoing impacts there when there's a separation or a divorce, that there's big financial disparity, and that can cause some issues as well. And missing out on life experiences. Like, I'm not a parent, but Lance, you've got 4 kids, and I think a lot of men code childcare, parenting as a woman's task, and they're missing out on what I imagine are some really amazing experiences in being a parent, in seeing these young people grow and evolve and, become bigger people, more rich people, in all the ways that we do as we grow. But if someone were to say, oh, yeah, I'll leave that to the missus, then they're missing out on this chunk of life, and their kids are missing out on an involved, active parent that should be there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think a really powerful role model as well. Lance, dad of 3 boys, how fantastic it is that you have such an awareness of this stuff, and how you are an incredibly positive role model for your sons, maybe particularly, where boys often, if the mum is the more involved caregiver, they might miss out on that good role model if dad is a bit distant, right?
And that emotional modelling too, right? If dad's sort of pretty closed off, doesn't share his feelings, well, not surprising if the kids learn, well, that's what a man's meant to be like because they're looking at dad. I expect that's not what Lance's kids are experiencing, but I know that there's plenty of young men who've had that experience of their dad kind of being a bit closed off, right? Just being someone they don't...
Just not there.
Yeah, emotionally not there, physically not there,
Yeah.
So really lacking in those role models and being able to say, like, what is a man capable of?
Yeah, so again, like just, carving out all these possibilities, all these future things that they could be, because they're already throwing those in the, oh, I'm not like that because I'm a man box, right? And that's sort of just...
And men don't do that.
Men don't do that, And, we're talking about men, of course, women do experience sort of gender roles, gender norms, but I think there's... my experience is that women often have a bit more willingness to interrogate or be flexible at that. Not all of them. It's going to depend on their upbringing and their personality, but I think perhaps there's more of a willingness to talk about this stuff, to explore this stuff, and men often kind of take it as face value that what I was taught, systems that I was part of growing up, are just sort of inherently okay, and I should just be following along in that path.
Yeah.
Don't even think about it as... how am I a man? Yeah.
Right.
No, it's not even giving thought to it, sort of thing.
And I think maybe the last bit, and again, it came up in the sort of the list Lance was talking about of potential harms there, is that discrimination. Like when you're defining yourself by exclusion, there's often levels of hierarchy. There's better than. There are dangerous versions of masculinity, certainly not all masculinities, but there are flavors of masculinity that are very much about being better than women, for example, or better than gay men, or, these sort of ways we're saying I'm more pure or I'm more masc because I'm not doing those things, I'm better than you. And because you're doing those things, you're doing childcare, you're doing emotions, you're doing any of these kinds of things that are coded as, internally coded by that person as not manly enough, that person gets devalued. And that obviously has impacts on relationships. It has impacts on other people in society when, discriminatory attitudes exist. I don't think we can really even divorce that from Obviously there's sort of racist flavors that can come through in some of that as well. I think that when someone holds discriminatory beliefs, they're more likely to be able to hold other discriminatory beliefs as well. It doesn't always happen. And of course, we're not just talking about white men here, that, men from any ethnic group are capable of holding harmful versions of masculinity. But I think the two can go hand in hand pretty easily.
I think what you said so interesting, Michael, about men's and women's kind of view on masculine versus feminine identities. And I think you're right that women, probably there's been, and maybe it's through feminism, but there's been sort of more of an emphasis on women developing like what might be considered more masculine abilities, like being assertive, holding their boundaries, being ambitious, climbing the ladder, corporate ladder, whatever, all of that sort of stuff.
None of that's easy. Don't get me wrong. There's certainly situations where people are discriminated against there. But
100%.
When we look at the way that our society holds, I talk about this kind of hierarchy, and it's kind of built in, right? Because when we think about, for example, a young woman who gets called a tomboy, right? She's engaging in activities that are perhaps a bit more masculine, like boy-coded than they are purely girl-coded. That's usually not a derogatory term, right?
No.
But if a boy is described as girly, that's rarely being sort of implied as that's a lovely thing that he is. That's kind of like, there's a deficiency there, there's a problem there, is kind of the way that society views a young male who has all sorts of
more
behaviours.
More female-coded behaviours,
that aren't exclusively male-coded. But if a woman decides to pick up, a young woman decides to pick up a few mask behaviours, maybe she helps dad out in the garage, or maybe she just stands up to people and says her mind. That's kind of seen as good on her for kind of opting into being a bit like a man. Isn't that a good thing for her to do? Yeah.
Exactly. And you're right, but it doesn't work the other way around. And I feel like that's maybe where we need to go as a society, that, when we see a little boy expressing his emotions or, talking with his friends about how he's feeling, that we go, isn't that great that he's doing that, rather than, what a wuss, or whatever other derogatory terms we might have. So I feel like that's where we need to make progress.
And we're speaking in generalities, of course. That, some parents, of course, are encouraging and they're rewarding that behaviour. But I think it's that, like, certainly when I grew up, even with some fairly progressive parents and a mum who was very, she'd done studies in early childhood development, and that was sort of her interest. So I certainly don't think I ever felt judged by my parents, if I did things that weren't very manly. And yet I still felt like sort of societally, in the playground, in the classroom, those kinds of things, there was still sort of that stuff all still came through in some way.
Yes, so interesting.
Yes, because you can try and do all the right things at home, but then outside of the home,
unless you're going to keep your kid at home,
everybody else,
the rest of their life, they're going to experience society.
Locked up in the house and away from every other influence.
And I think about the students that we meet with. We see a fair number of international students, and I think that's actually a really interesting thing that I see in male students that come to the counselling service, is that they've come from a different culture, from a different flavours of masculinity, and they're trying to adjust that to match here. And there can be some friction there, or if their masculinity doesn't fit the masculinity that they're seeing in the society in Melbourne here. So it's not that there's sort of one wrong or one dangerous flavour of this. There's elements that are going to work in some contexts and not in others, but I think also work for some people and work against some people, and the people around these men as well.
Yeah, I really like that emphasis on that idea that this traditional masculinity is really restrictive, and so it's going to limit what people can experience, but also how they might adapt to these new environments or to new relationships or to new settings. So I think it's a really, really good point. I'm wondering if we can maybe move towards media, and I was wondering, Lance, if you might be able to talk to us about how maybe pornography plays a role in the development of unhealthy sexual behaviours.
Well, this is certainly an area of interest of mine, and certainly working in high school, I see the impacts of this quite a lot. Look, I think, the whole pornography industry is geared towards men, that men are generally the consumers. And they do portray women, in a very unrealistic ways, I would say. There are, growing areas of ethical porn and so on, but mostly even they would often, confirm these sort of stereotypes about, sexual roles. And usually the men have the power. It's all about, the man's gratification. So that causes problems, certainly for men who are adolescents, like I often work with. That becomes problematic because they're trying to test out all these things on their relationships with their girlfriends. And it's not, what they see in pornography is very, very different from what women and adolescent girls actually want. The other issue is that they get desensitized to some pretty horrific things often. They might get sent something on their Discord chat or whatever that is quite graphic often, and then they go in the bedroom and they try the same thing and they like, well, I thought that's what women wanted. So it causes a range of different challenges within relationships. I think that there is a greater emphasis on violence within a lot of pornography and greater increase in choking behaviours, more presentations to emergency departments for this kind of stuff. And I guess, both for women and for men, like body image issues would be huge, men and women. They have certain body types and often, there's not different body types being portrayed in most pornography.
Yeah. And I'd say as well that unrealistic portrayals of men there as well, that I think men around sexual performance and endurance, strength and flexibility.
Penis size.
Right, yeah. I had the opportunity to talk with sex workers at various times, as part of my clinical work, and some have told me about, some who've worked in pornography have talked to me about even the filming process, that, what gets turned into a 20 or 30 minute clip is a highly edited full day of filming, right? That's a lot of work that gets compressed into only the most visually appealing on camera moments, that things are reshot as it goes. And so when someone sees something, they see this very idealized, for some people's ideals perhaps, version of this alleged sexual encounter that really is not very realistic, as Lance said.
I mean, we could have a whole episode on that alone, really, but it's clearly a powerful negative influence.
Young people are often getting their sex education through pornography as well, which is a huge problem, I think, within society, because, if that's their norm, it's going to cause a whole lot of unhealthy sexual encounters and relationships and, potentially damaging a whole lot of men and women, I think, and anywhere in between.
And on still thinking about media and the role of media, and Michael, you mentioned at the top of the episode that you're a big consumer of social media. How does that influence maybe some of the gender expectations for men?
Sure, yeah. And I think the algorithms nowadays are a lot more sensitive than just male and female profiles, right? They're building individual profiles. They're tracking you between websites. There's a market in selling your little bits of your data on to build bigger and better profiles of you and what you want. But I think that, very much what we see is that those algorithms are incentivized to do things that maintain engagement, and that, the things that engage people are often provocative. So I think that can be an element of it, that either provoking outrage or provoking interest and affiliation for people. There's sort of these echo chambers that kind of form, right? That if you're Twitter nowadays or X, not so good at that, I think now there's a lot of content being blasted on your feed, whether you like it or not. But, TikTok, for example, is sort of renowned for having a really sensitive algorithm that will very quickly, even after engaging with it with a brand new account for only a couple of hours from a new IP address where it doesn't know anything about you, it'll pretty quickly be giving you a For You page that's, really focusing on the kind of videos you're spending more than a couple of seconds looking at, right? It's tracking all of this information. So it's going to be giving you lots of what it thinks you're going to stay watching, which might not be what you want, ironically, but it's the stuff that you're willing to engage with. In that sort of male space, I think that we see some really dangerous trends. So we talked about sort of echo chambers, and I guess echo chambers inherently reinforce stereotypes and biases. They often really set these strong expectations for people about how they should be. So they sort of promote this kind of in-group identity. And often a really easy way to promote in-group identity is by denigrating the out-group, by saying we're better than, right? So it ties back to what we were saying earlier. For men, I guess it depends on the profile. That won't be every man, but often, there can be sort of this kind of a hyper-masculine content. So this is like strength, power, control, the same things that Lance was mentioning there that pornography does, and that some of the masculine norms can be sort of built around. And that abuse and disrespect, as part of that identifying and denigrating an out-group, it's really common to see that get talked about as kind of, they're normalized, I suppose, in some ways, that there are us who are good and there are these other people who don't deserve respect in the same way we do. These really sort of toxic communities. So, the outgroups could be women, it could be non-straight men. And again, we see race sort of popping up as a flavour in all of these as well. Radicalisation pathways probably are worth mentioning there as well, that, YouTube's algorithm, for example, has been a lot of really interesting research and reporting, journalistic reporting on the ways in which even a couple of years ago that you could start by watching some fairly mundane videos that were like politically themed or even were just sort of masculine coded about, cars. And then the suggested videos, if you were to click like the first suggested video each time and follow that path down and down and down, it wouldn't be too long before you're getting served things that have quite a political tone, that have
interesting.
Perhaps, really sexist and misogynistic tones over time as well, homophobic, racist, these kinds of things can all creep in because they're the kind of content that people, once they're caught up in that world, tend to consume quite a lot of. So an algorithm, it's really just about maximizing the amount of time eyes spend on following this screen so we can serve them ads, do prioritize the kind of, potentially quite dangerous radicalizing content.
Gosh, that's very concerning.
Yeah, so can you tell us a bit more about the role of online movements like men's rights activism, so-called incels, the alt-right, or influencers like Andrew Tate? These have been really, really big movements in the last few years.
Yeah, and this space keeps changing. If you'd asked me sort of 5 or 6 years ago, I might have talked about the intellectual dark web was sort of the language that was being used for some of these sort of right-wing influences. Now we get sort of, alt-right. We talk about the manosphere sometimes as well. So that's sort of Andrew Tate, Joe Rogan-like figures. Often, again, there's a real play, I think, towards provocativeness in these groups. So, or these people, it gets attention. And it's not necessarily about winning people over to that specific viewpoint. Although in young men, they like being a bit provocative. We've all sort of dealt with young, teenage boys who like doing things to provoke a bit of a response. I grew up in the South Park era, and that sort of thing was quite common there, I'd say. But, what happens is that someone parrots these things that they don't even believe. They do it because they know it's going to get a response. But it warms them up a little bit, right? Over time, they get this sort of what's called the Overton window, so this perspective on appropriate beliefs, like within the bounds of normality, and they'll find that they'll get pushed and pushed and pushed. So at some point they're starting with making jokes about women, and it won't be too long, if they keep up that pattern, that perhaps they'll internalize a bit of that belief. They'll start behaving in ways that are less respectful to women, or they'll be talking about men who aren't so manly, and before too long they might start applying these kinds of things to themselves. Often there's this real idea around men as victims in some of these spaces. So, we saw the Me Too movement, for example, that didn't really result in a huge amount of consequences for men, but it involved a lot of talk around men having consequences. And I think that leads to this idea of these sort of beliefs that men are being discriminated against, or that there's the perpetrators of injustice against men are these outgroups, right? Women, for example, women are out to get men. Lance talked about sexual violence and sexual harm there, and I think that's a space where there's a lot of conversation around rare phenomenon like women, manufacturing allegations. Like, it's not that it never happens that a woman, of course there have been women historically who have told lies about sexual harm, but the research suggests that it's a very small amount. It's far dwarfed by the number of women who aren't comfortable coming forward because of fears about what that'll do to their reputation, to the other people in their lives. But it's a good way, I think, talking about that other people are out to get you, and that the only people who will have your back are other people like us, right? Other men who get it, other men who are in the inner circle like you. That's a pretty good way to catch people and to keep them keep them sort of trapped, right? Because they're going to feel threatened and disenfranchised by changes in society, some of the stuff we've been talking about. And they're being told, you belong, you're one of us, you're part of this brotherhood, or whatever language gets used there. That these sort of progressive or woke kind of things, this is all kind of a conspiracy to undermine what you should have, what you deserve, what your natural rights are as a man. If you're feeling hard done by, and realistically, a lot of people, for lots of reasons, feel hard done by society. That's not all about gender by any means. That's about financial privilege. It's about, status. But if you're at a point where you're vulnerable and someone reaches out and said, oh yeah, actually what's happening is there's someone who's out to get you and we get it. We've got your back on this. That's a pretty tempting offer, right? If you're not having much success in dating, for example, and someone says, oh, well, that's because all women are horrible bitches who really, only just want to trap you or only want to make accusations. And what you've got to do is you've got to be big and strong, or you've got to be some kind of, independent lone wolf sigma who sort of doesn't care about this stuff. You need to numb and kill that part of you that cares about other people's approval. If I was hurting a lot, that'd be a kind of tempting thing to invite me to do, right? If I didn't have other ways to get support, that group of people who are offering this support, this supporting hand that happens to reinforce traditional ideas of masculinity, that's the undertone, when really the offer here is just, hey, someone cares about you. Someone gets it, that it's hard. That's going to be something that catches people pretty easily.
I think that's so interesting, like just in terms of that sense of something's really being taken away from me that I should have, this sense of entitlement. And that it's like there's a lot of fear there, I think. It's this response to fear. So I have to be bigger, I have to be stronger, or let's band together as a group and fight against this. Like, it's a real cause.
Yeah. And it doesn't take too long for that better than narrative to start coming out, right? Because we are all looking out for each other. well, actually, let's talk about who the people that are out to get us are. It's these other groups, or not even out to get us. Sometimes it's just, now that we're all here together, we can talk about how we're really better than all these other people, right? How, women are really stupid and men should be running the world, as they have for a long time. There's this saying that sort of when you're used to privilege, equality feels a bit like discrimination, right? When you're used to kind of being on top.
Well, you've lost something.
Yeah, that's such a powerful observation.
If we look into the political side of this, right, this is sort of a classic fascist themed kind of call. Is like, look at your history, look at this imagined history that maybe never existed. Look what's been taken from you. We can help you restore that thing that was taken from you, that was lost. That's our goal. And so, that's that kind of radicalization, right? When you get used to this idea that, things have been taken, it's not too big a jump to go to society has shifted in ways that are actually about depriving me of my, of what is due to me.
And you know what else it reminds me of when you were talking earlier, Michael, is the way that cults get people in. I listened to this great podcast called A Little Bit Culty, if anyone's interested in that stuff. Really good podcast. They talk about how, by the time you get to the end of where you end up in a cult and you go, how on earth did I let myself get to the point where I've been doing these really bizarre things? And the point is that it never starts like that. It's like this gradual, a little bit more and a little bit more. And once you've tolerated that much, then we can add a little bit more. And before you know it, you're way over here on the other side. And it's not till you kind of break the spell in a way that you can look back and go, how did I get here?
Right. It's that classic sort of frog in a pot metaphor, right? That
yes.
If you drop a frog into a pot of hot water, it's going to hop straight out because that's so dangerous. But if you slowly turn up the temperature bit by bit, the frog might just sit there tolerating these little changes until it's too late to do anything about it. The high control groups is, I think, the sort of the academic language that's used to talk about cult-like movements. I think that we could look at a lot of that kind of manosphere stuff as also being high control, right? It's about having a leader who's in charge and gets to dictate the language, dictate the beliefs of the group. But being part of a group where you're all in it together, you all sort of, maybe you don't overtly care about each other because maybe that's a bit too feminine coded. You're all good brothers and you've got each other's backs, might be a more mask way of talking about the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So there's some similar flavours.
Yeah. And so, let's say that someone is getting swept into that or is maybe being influenced by harmful gender expectations. What do you think would be some of the signs that would tell a man that he's maybe being negatively influenced?
Yeah, I think paying a bit of attention to when those kind of norm buttons get pushed for themselves or by other people. So if you like, you see a bit of clothing that you like and then you go, oh, actually, no, I couldn't wear that colour because that's a bit girly, right? That's that gender norm kicking in, right? Maybe checking in a bit on what kind of media, what kind of jokes, what's the sort of stuff that you're consuming? Are the memes that you and your friends are sending, are they kind of about feeling better than someone else because of their gender, or are they about sort of gendered behaviour in some way? Because that, again, is this kind of creeping tide that can turn into really discriminatory or harmful kind of approaches. Aggression, as we touched on, can often be one of the things. If you're noticing that you're being more aggressive than you're comfortable being, or if you're having difficulty expressing your feelings, seeking help, probably that kind of restrictive view of gender that might be showing up for you there. If the people around you are making, sexist comments or jokes, they're kind of harmless, they're just a joke. But I think as well, we often look at ourselves in the context of the relationships around us. So, thinking about the women or the people who aren't men in your life, family, friendships, romantic relationships, do those feel equal? Do you pressure yourself to perform in certain roles in those relationships, right? Do you need to be the provider and the breadwinner? If your partner suddenly gets a new job and they're making more money than you and you go, oh, this doesn't feel right, that's gender there, right? That's that sort of that gender ideas that say, well, a man has to be more successful, has to be providing more for the household. I feel disempowered if someone is more successful than me. And I can't be disempowered in a romantic relationship because that means that they're in charge, they're on top, they've got control. That's not how everyone would view it. But if that's what your mind jumps to when you find out something that perhaps would be good news in other circles of, hey, I got a pay rise, that's interesting. I think that'd be worth paying attention to if you notice your mind doing that. And I think the last bit, when you meet someone new is often a good litmus test for this. What assumptions do you make about someone who's new? Based on their gender, on the way they express their gender, on their sexuality, if you know anything about that. Like what kind of stereotypes do you ascribe to that? Check in on that and go, okay, what does this say to me about what I've internalized? What kind of messages I've taken on board?
Yeah, so helpful. Well, maybe Lance, how might others recognize if someone they know is being influenced by these unhelpful masculine stereotypes?
Well, I'd say similar to what Michael was just talking about. Yeah, any of those kind of increased aggression, if they're talking about Andrew Tate or similar social media influencers, anything that talks about like a power imbalance, towards men. Those coercive control kind of things within romantic relationships. I think those things can be very dangerous and lead to increased likelihood of things going downhill when it comes to relationships. I guess the one that I kind of most identified with in that masculine norms index was that self-control and self-reliance. So I think that's something to be really, be conscious of, I think, for anyone who identifies as men, but also in the people around us. If you can kind of tell that they're struggling, but they're just like, I'm going to stiff up a lip, I'm going to get through this by myself, that I think that's probably likely to be the, masculine norms that have at play there. They're sort of, it's good to kind of try and push into those things and maybe trying to question them or, think about different ways they can be a man. The other one is anything that's kind of low empathy or low gentleness or kindness sort of thing, those, stereotypically maybe, motherly instincts. I think, men have those as well. But I guess if you see people around you that are very resistant to that sort of thing, maybe as a father or in their work role. And I guess, as we talked about earlier about pornography, if they're consuming a lot of pornography that maybe has some not great content in it, those things could be a factor as well.
Yeah, and especially if that's sort of changing their own sexual behaviour, I think that might be something that a partner might notice.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I was just recalling last time, Lance, when we were talking about planning for this episode, and you were telling us about one of the coach of your kids, was it basketball or football team, was the really big bloke. Can you tell that story? Because I think that's a really good story as well, just because we're about to segue into maybe thinking about healthy modern masculine identity.
So my son plays football for a local club. One season he had a very strongly conforming to masculine norms coach, very yelly, very aggressive, go out in there and kill, and that kind of message. And then the following season, a gigantic Islander bloke coached them, and just almost the polar opposite. Just a really gentle, kind, fairly quietly spoken, very good footballer. And my son recalled one incident where his son was playing on the team, and he made a terrible error. Kicked it to the opposition, and the opposition got a goal. And my son was thinking, this coach is going to absolutely rip shreds off his son. And he's like, no, it's all right. We all do that. It's fine. Head up. Let's go to the next play. And that was just so beautiful to watch for all the boys in that team, 18 boys, to see that response. And many of the coaches, obviously are pretty strong on the masculine norms, but to have a different perspective or a different way of being a man is so powerful. And that's part of what I try and bring to my own, fathering and my counselling, and like to show a different way of being a man that doesn't conform too strongly to those traditional norms and stereotypes.
Absolutely. I love that story. I love the fact that he was such a big burly bloke as well, and probably to look at him you would have gone, whoa, he's going to be, really classically, very blokey man sort of thing. And he just wasn't. He was just a very balanced, kind, emotionally in touch person. And what a great role model for those 18 boys.
An example comes to mind for me when I'm talking to some of my clients even around sort of masculinity, and maybe it's one that sort of betrays my own age a little bit there, but I think of the way that Aragorn was portrayed in the Lord of the Rings movies, right? He's this brave guy, he does some, really daring stuff, he's strong, he's sort of relatively masculine, and yet he's also empathic and caring towards his friends. He expresses doubt at times about whether he's up to the stuff that he's meant to be doing. He cares, like he shows physical and emotional care for people in a way that perhaps that more limiting, more restrictive version of masculinity would forbid him from doing, because that's not men's work, right? And even though he's, hanging around with a bunch of guys, like he's there, he's on their team, he's cheerleading them, he is experiencing a range of emotions, a range of experiences in a way that I think is, a sort of a bit of a potential role model for people when they're thinking about it. Maybe it's what would Aragorn do in this situation?
I love it.
I think what I love about both of those examples is this feeling that I just got of it's like such a sense of physical and emotional safety. And it's almost like, how do we encourage that in men, that we, and to be drawn to those types of people, that I can be safe with this person no matter what happens.
Yeah. Not that getting benefits to themselves should be the goal of this, I think, but, think for our male listeners, like thinking about the ways that women experience you.
Yeah.
Right? Here we have someone saying, when I think of those two ideals, I feel safe. And if I'm safe, I'm, more willing to have conversations, takes more risks, this kinds of thing, right? Whereas if someone feels unsafe in your presence, it's pretty unlikely that they're going to want a friendship, a romantic relationship, these kinds of things, right? So if you can be someone who genuinely creates an aura of safety for the people in your life, then perhaps this ties into that kind of, we didn't really get into the details with the incel sort of stuff, but these sort of people who are really feeling like hard done by in terms of pursuing romantic relationships. And there's often a sort of bitterness that can form around this. And unfortunately, if you're bitter, that tends to be something that's going to push people away, right? It's actually less, it's this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. You're going to turn people off. You're going to make people not want to spend time with you, especially women that might otherwise be interested.
People be walking on eggshells around you.
Exactly.
So if you can create instead this experience of being, safe enough, you're not going to be perfect. Who is? We can't all be that coach. We can't all be Aragorn.
No.
but we can be someone who is able to kind of demonstrate that we reflect some of our own vulnerabilities, that we're aware of our own strengths and weaknesses, and that we're okay with that, right? That we're not sort of desperate, or we're not trying to hide that weakness for fear that we'll be judged harshly for it. Other people will see that and they'll say, oh yeah, that's like me. I'm also someone who has mixed experiences, who has, is better at some things than others, right? I feel safer around this person than someone who's performing as perfect, who's saying, oh, I don't have any deficiencies. You're all worse than me. That's not a very appealing person to be around. We've probably all had someone in our life who couldn't recognise that they were in the wrong, and that doesn't someone that you generally want to spend more time with.
No, so true. Just to finish up, Lance, I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about your view on the development of maybe a healthier identity, particularly in your role working in high schools and around sort of developing young men. And I remember last time when we talked about this, you were saying, you had ideas for programs and things that you'd like to institute in the school, but it's always hard, budgets and all of that sort of stuff. So I'm just really curious to know about what your ideas are around how do we sort of turn this around to help men develop this much healthier identity that's better for them and also better for the people around them.
Well, yeah, look, I think a lot of it comes back to those early childhood experiences, really, particularly the men and women, that maybe have not had children yet that are listening to this podcast, even having to think about how you're going to socialise these children who are born usually male or female. There are some intersex people, and be able to raise them in a way that's not rigidly stereotyped in either way, like to be particularly female or male. I think that's one of the big challenges as a society. One of the things that I think about in my role in the school is we're getting these young men and women at the age of 12 or 13, and they've already established pretty strong views on these things. And so it's really hard work to actually challenge that in a way that they can actually start to change, or at least consider changing. They're often not even contemplating changing because they haven't even thought about it before. And so I guess for me, it's one of those, one of the questions I nearly always ask my male clients and students that I work with is, what is the type of man that you want to become? And actually just start thinking about, what does masculinity mean to you? What are your models of masculinity? Often we'll talk about fathers and grandfathers and uncles and coaches and stuff like that. And then, I like to often challenge some of those norms. So for example, I was looking for a phone cover and I could have got a black one because that's very, plain and boring. But, this one was $20 cheaper, which is purple, like a mauvey sort of purpley colour. Like I deliberately chose it because my instinct initially was, I can't have that because that's a girly colour. But I actually wanted to push into that a little bit and go, well, you know what, it's a stereotype, but I'm going to try and have that as a talking point sometimes, and it has been with some of the students I work with or some of my friends, like, what do you got that for?
It's an opportunity to talk about this stuff with other men. It invites conversation around it, which maybe wouldn't normally happen in conversation, with other guys.
And so, and that's another thing that I often, in those conversations with men at the footy, or like I'm not really into footy. I don't like it at all. But I go and I try and talk to people and try and sort of almost demonstrate a different type of masculinity. Like I'm not really I couldn't care less about whether, the Bombers are winning or whatever. But I honest about that, and I've had people say, oh, you mustn't have been brought up in Australia or you mustn't have been brought up in Victoria. I'm like, no, well, actually I have. I just don't like football. I guess any opportunity to really show a different type of masculinity. I think most people that meet me would say, yes, he's a man, but, I'm a touch of my emotions. I talk about it all the time in my work. I love cooking, and I'm decent at sewing, and some of these things that I can do. And I guess, even the way I parent is very different from your traditional male dad. So I think it's good to show lots of different ways of being men. And I guess, for those women that are listening, similarly, like, I think talk about how it is to be a woman and what that means to you, and what are those stereotypes that you are trying to get pigeonholed into, and how could you maybe push against those, try to find a new way of being a woman as well. I think it's both ways.
Yeah, and I think as a mother of a son, because I have a son as well, I think a lot about these things too. Obviously, his dad is a very positive, well, not obviously, but I can tell you his dad is a very positive role model, similar to you two, very much, in touch with his emotions and willing to be vulnerable and express those and show softness and empathy. And, he's got fantastic emotional intelligence. So I'm very lucky in that way. And that's been really great for my son. I was talking to him about the problem of male violence against women, intimate partner violence, and, just wanting him to be sort of aware of it and have it be, not just something that's seen as a women's problem, but that it's a men's problem as well, or really is a men's problem that affects women. And he said to me, I'm very aware of that, Mum, when I walk home from, my uni classes and it's late at night and, it's dark on the campus and there's a woman walking ahead of me and I know she can hear my footsteps, and I immediately thinking, what must she be feeling hearing these footsteps behind her? And so I sort of pull back a bit because I don't know how else to make her feel safe. Like, I can't call out to her and go, it's okay, I'm one of the good ones, because that would probably freak her out. So, I just try and sort of pull back so she can feel safe. And I said, I'm really proud that you're able to do that and to consider it from that perspective as well. Maybe good role models is the way, maybe, to sort of start to chip away at the problem.
Yeah, and so for people who maybe haven't really questioned this within themselves, how might they begin to, I suppose? Maybe they've listened to this episode now and are thinking about it, but maybe how might they reflect a bit more on what they can do differently, or how they might be able to think about their own biases differently?
There's something that pops to mind for me, I suppose. We talked about noticing when you're feeling these instincts, whether it's societal pressure or more even just a peer pressure. Just checking in on yourself when you're noticing, I'm feeling this urge to act in a certain way because I want to keep other people happy, or I want to be respected or something. And then thinking about it in that moment, or maybe beforehand, you've had to think about, what kind of person, what kind of man do you want to be? And maybe acting a bit more like that person rather than necessarily just following what it is that the peer pressure is sort of urging you to do. That might mean calling out a friend if it feels like that they're stepping over a line there, right? That might be a bit uncomfortable. But if you want to be someone who, does care about the people around you, then maybe that sometimes means calling someone out when they are, being inappropriate.
That's a very good point, isn't it? Yeah, sort of calling each other to account a little bit more, like, more male role models like the two of you, but, also calling men to account when they maybe are engaging in, sharing misogynistic memes and having a laugh kind of thing. Yeah, it's a pretty confronting thing to do, to kind of go, is that really funny? Yeah, but I think those are maybe the small things that will start to sort of to change.
And, we opened talking a bit about well-being and the impacts on male well-being, so maybe that's another big one, is just like taking care of yourself physically and mentally, talking to your GP. Whoever you are, whatever age you are, your body's going to be changing over time. There are going to be new features, new medical events that occur there. Having a regular GP is a luxury in many parts of the world, and if you're in Australia like us, it's something that's fairly available to many people. And, using that service can be life-changing, in some ways. And then mental health support, of course, we're perhaps a bit biased in this regard, but, I think we all think that's a pretty important thing for anyone.
The biggest one that I think about is that one of self-reliance in my work and just in my life in general. Like, I'm always, like Michael was saying, encouraging people to rely on other people, actually talk with other men if you are a man. I think the stats around loneliness are, are highest for middle-aged men. The life gets in the way sort of thing, and we lose our relationships with other men. But it's so important that we aren't islands and we don't cloister ourselves away and don't actually interact with other men apart from a beer over the footy sort of thing. Like, that we actually need to genuinely. That's probably the biggest one that I try to address in my relationships with men is don't be too self-reliant. Try and push into that masculine norm and try and address it. I think I tend to do that as well. And for the first time in my life, I'm starting to see a psychologist, and it's been really helpful. And that gives me a bit of credibility.
It's okay to ask for help and, rely on other people.
I think as a man, we often do get overt or more subtle feedback from women about how we're experienced. I think the overt's perhaps a bit rarer, but when it does happen, I think pay attention, because that's going to be some really useful information. Every woman might have a different experience of you, but if someone's sharing an experience of you, saying, hey, when you did this thing, it made me feel uncomfortable, or it crossed a line for me, that's pretty important to listen to. But then perhaps the part that's a little harder is paying attention for the less overt bits, right? Just tuning in, noticing, how is it people act around me when I say something? When I don't say something, what happens next? Thinking about the way that that masculinity, like certain limiting models of masculinity, have encouraged us to say that, to think that a man should be the head of the table, a man should have the loudest voice in the room, should be taking up more conversation space. And so seeing, even just doing some experiments for yourself about any of the stuff we've been talking about here, right? What happens if I do something a little bit different, and just get some data for myself about how that works for me? If I get a different colour phone case, what's that like? If I try keeping my mouth shut instead of making a joke at someone's expense, what's that like? What happens in the relationships when I don't speak up versus when I do? When I call someone out versus when I keep silent? All of these things have ripple effects.
One thing we haven't talked about much is the whole term of toxic masculinity, and that was deliberate because I think it does put people off. But I think maybe at the end of the episode it is worth talking about just briefly. And I think the reason we didn't sort of talk about it is because it does put people on the defensive, particularly men. I was like, I'm not a toxic man, so that they're not talking about me. So I guess to me, whenever I hear that term, I react against it myself, actually. It's good to think about the alternative and what is, what's the opposite of toxic masculinity. Maybe there's some modern or positive masculinity that we can develop. And I think there are some frameworks being developed. I know there's Dan Seidler is a psychologist in Melbourne that works for Movember, and looking at a whole heap of ways address masculinity in general terms, and looking at depression and that sort of thing. And my current thesis is looking at how depression might be related to masculinity and IPV. But I think it is good to think about what are the positive aspects of masculinity. And so I think of things like that. Maybe the Aragorn one is a good one to talk about. He's protective. He's he uses his strength to affect change in a positive way. The strength that we have to protect those with less power, because we are testosterone does make us bigger and stronger. That's the reality, and our brains are different. But we also have this opportunity as men to positive influence in the world as well. So I think we need to. It's good to acknowledge that there are toxic aspects to masculinity. But there are also some really positive things, like my son's coach, or hopefully the way some of the way I'm trying to bring up my boys, and there are some really lovely parts to being masculine as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really great place for us to finish today. Thank you so much, Lance and Michael, for joining us today on the podcast. We've had such a great conversation. It's been a real pleasure to talk about masculine identity with you, and we hope we can have you back on the podcast sometime soon. We're so happy you could join us today and share in our discussion on the various influences on masculine identity. Traditional masculine norms can lead to unrealistic and restrictive expectations, affecting mental health, relationships, and overall well-being. Understanding and challenging these norms is essential for fostering healthier, more inclusive expressions of masculinity that contribute to better health and better mental health outcomes for men and for those around them. We can each contribute by questioning harmful expectations, seeking out diverse role models, and advocating for change both personally and within our communities. If you found today's episode helpful, please subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review. If you're interested in more content on this, we recommend the Australian podcast, The Imperfects, hosted by three amazing men who talk about concepts of vulnerability, imperfection, and mental health. We'll put a link in our show notes. Thanks once again for tuning in. Until next time, take care and be kind to yourself. Thanks for joining us today on the Counselling Armchair, Nurturing Wellbeing and Study. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and learned a useful thing or two. Have a great week. And just remember that life can be amazing. See you next time.
Isn't life so amazing? Sometimes it can get crazy, but hey, that's okay. We've got another day to make mistakes and say sorry. There's no sense in our worry, 'cause all we can do is try our best to make it through with love.